Hi, today we're going to go over how to use React drag and drop. Some of the first things you need to understand is what really is React drag and drop. React drag and drop is a set of React higher order components to help you build complex drag and drop interfaces while keeping your components decoupled. What I mean by that is basically it'll help you quickly add easily make draggable items on your web page. What are we going to go over through this tutorial? We're going to first go through foundational concepts, then we're going to go through a walkthrough of a basic use case on React DND, another review on concepts, and then expand on some of the things we can do. And then there's going to be a final review. So, what is a backend? Drag drop context, item or type, drag source, drop target, monitor, and connector. These are just some of the things we're going to go over through in this tutorial. So, React DND first needs a backend. Now, what is a backend? React DND is built on top of HTML5 drag and drop API. For now, all you need to understand that all the backend does is translate the native DOM events into internal Redux actions that React DND can process. It's basically what is going to allow us to process every DOM event. React DND has its own library that uses the HTML5 backend, and to install it, we're going to write npm install React DND HTML5 backend in our terminal. What is the drag drop context? The drag drop context is in the context in which you are going to allow dragging and dropping interactions to occur. You're going to need to wrap your root component in a drag drop context. For example, let's say we imported React and component from React, and then we're going to import the HTML5 backend from the React DND HTML5 backend after installing it, of course, and then we're going to import drag drop context from React DND. We're going to define our class, but we're not going to export it there right away. We're going to export it after we define the class, like the following: export default drag drop context. And drag drop context is a higher order component, meaning we're going to pass it some arguments. On the first call after drag drop context, we're going to pass it the HTML5 backend, and on the second call, we're going to pass it the class itself. In our case, it's going to be the board. The next things you're going to need to understand are what items and types are. Before we proceed any further, just remember this is just a quick walkthrough of the things you need to understand before we go into our use case. An item is basically a plain JavaScript object used to describe what is being dragged. For example, in our case, we're going to be dragging a piece around the board. So we're going to have an empty object, we're going to pass it a piece ID and give it an ID. The next thing is types. Types are strings identifying a whole class of items. They're going to allow you to connect certain drag sources with certain drop targets. We're going to go over both in detail. There will usually be a separate file exporting all the types. For example, here we have an object that we are naming item types. In it, we have a few key value pairs. Each key will be representing each type. For example, we have a card that's going to be representing a type of string card, and a knight that's going to be representing a type of string knight. And then we're going to be exporting these item types to use further. Here comes one of the biggest topics in React DND, a drag source. The drag source is a wrapper that will allow you to make all your components draggable. You need to pass in 3 parameters in the first call: the type, the specification, and the collecting function. And then in the second call, you're going to pass in the component itself. For example, let's say we're importing drag source from React DND and everything else required to make a React component. We define the React component, but we're not exporting it there right away. We export default drag source, and in that first call, we're going to pass it something called the type, which we already went over, the specification, and the collecting function. And in the second call, we're going to pass it the component itself. Now, the type we already went over. Remember what the type was? It's basically a string describing the object that is being dragged. Now, the specification is a plain JavaScript object with a few allowed methods on it. It's going to describe how the drag source reacts to the drag and drop event. And each method in the specification takes in 2 parameters, props and monitor. Some also take in component as a third parameter. You may need to refer to the docs for specific examples. Here you can see we have an object called knight source, and it has only one key value pair, begin drag. Begin drag is a function that's going to take in 3 parameters, props, monitor, and component, and it's going to return an object with some key value pairs. The first key value pair is going to return is the type. The type is going to be a knight, and then it's also going to return a knight ID, which we're pulling off from the props.id. Now, this object that is returning is actually the item. Remember what the item was? The item was just a plain JavaScript object used to describe what is being dragged. And you can return anything from this object, but in our case, we decided to return the type itself and the knight ID. This way, we can use these attributes in further use case. The next thing you're going to need to know is what the collecting function is. The collecting function is a function that takes in two parameters, connect and monitor, and it's going to return an object with keys that will later become props. Here we have one example of a collecting function collect, and it's taken in two parameters, connect and monitor, and it's going to be returning some keys that are later going to become props. I will explain this during the use case. Here we're going to name it connect drag source, and we're going to call a method on the connect function, on the connect.drag source, and then we're going to have another one called isDragging, which we're going to pull off the monitor.isDragging. So what is this connect and monitor? Connect is either going to be an instance of the drag source connector or the drop target connector. They're each going to have their own methods on it that will return functions that will later become props. In the drag source, connect has two available methods on it, connect.drag source and connect.drag preview. And in drop target, there's only one method on it called connect.dropTarget. The next thing is the monitor. Now the monitor, just like connect, is either an instance of the drag source monitor or the drop target monitor, and they each have their own methods on it, and these methods will return functions that will later become props. Some of the more common methods in the drag source connector are the monitor.isDragging, the monitor.canDrag, and the monitor.getItem. And in the drop target is going to be the monitor.canDrop, the monitor.isOver, and the monitor.getItem. Now we talk a lot about drop target, so what is the drop target? The drop target, just like the drag source, is a wrapper that's going to allow to make the component react to a drag source interacting with it. You're going to need to pass in three parameters in the first call: the type, the specification, and the collecting function. We already went over these, so I won't go over them again. Then you're going to pass in the class as the second call, just like the drag source. Now that we've gone through some of the basic concepts, I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of the starting code. You can pause and play whenever you want, but this is pretty much basic React stuff, so I'm just going to let you just absorb it in for a while. As you can see, we have a basic React .NET render. We're rendering a list. We're passing in a card position, the root L. Now if you want to go over lists, rendering out three lists: an orange list, a green list, and a blue list. Depending on the prop, we're going to either render the card or we're not going to render the card at all. Here's some styling. And then we have our individual list. Little div is taking in the children. This is either going to be a card or is going to be presented as null. And now let's go over the card. We have a little card. It's just a div, and this is the Unicode for a heart. And this game.js file you can completely ignore for now. We're not going to be using it. Now here's a single list. Went over that already. Just back to the card one more time. Just pause and play whenever you want to try to get a feel of the code. Once you finish observing the code, you can continue to play. This is how the starting code should look for now. As you can see, we have a basic list, and then we have three individual lists inside: an orange one, a green one, and a blue one, and this is our heart div. Let's now make our components draggable. Let's start by importing the required items. Import HTML5 backend. Import the drag drop context from Backend. Now remember, the drag drop context is what's going to allow all our components to become draggable. Any child in the drag drop context will either become a drag source or a drop target. And the HTML5 backend is simply what we're going to need to make anything draggable. So let's now start defaulting here. Export default drag drop context. We're going to pass in the HTML5 backend as the first argument in the first call, and we're going to pass in the component into the second call. And that's it. The next thing we're going to do is define a drag source. So let's start importing the required. Then instead of export defaults, we're going to export default drag source. We're going to pass in the item type as the first argument. And for now, our item type is just going to be a card. Then we're going to pass in specification and then the collecting function. And in the second call, we're just going to pass it the argument itself. So now, let's define our specification. Just pass it one for now. And then we're going to define our collecting function. Remember, it's going to take in connect and monitor. And for now, it's going to return connect drag source, and then the is dragging from the monitor. And now, instead of returning this div right away, what we're going to do is we're going to gain access to our new props. Connect drag source is dragging, not equal to this props. Now over here, we're going to do return connect drag source, and then pass in our JSX as an argument. Now that we've created both a drag drop context and a drag source, we need to define a drop target. Where is our card going to be allowed to be dropped? So let's start by importing drop target from Backend right here, and then export it away. 1, 2, export drop target. Pass in our type, pass in our specification. We're going to call that list target and pass in a collecting function. And in the second call, we're going to be passing in the React component itself. So now, we define our specification. List target, function, I'm going to explain exactly how we get this move card function in a bit. So whenever we drop something, we're going to call this move card function, and we're going to pass in the new prop. And then let's define our collect, connect, enter, connect, drop, target, and now let's get access to our props. Connect, drop, target, list props, and let's use it right here. Okay. We should now be able to see our card being dragged across the screen. It won't be allowed to drop anywhere because we didn't define a move card function, but it should be draggable. Let's see it in action. Oops, syntax error somewhere. There we go. Okay, cool. As you can see, the card is not draggable, but I can't really drop it anyway because move card is not defined. Let's now explain how we got that move card. Here is where the game.js file comes into play. Game.js file is going to allow us to use the move card function. We're going to define a card position. We're going to set that to green. We're going to define an observer. For now, it's going to be null. We're going to be exporting two functions. The first is going to be an observe, and it's going to take in a function, which is going to be our entire React DOM. And then we're going to pass it a card position. We're going to set observer to that and then pass it in a card position. And the second is the move card is going to take in a color, and then we're going to call observer again with that new card position. So now we can start using it. Let's import, observe from game.file. Now instead of calling React.render right away, what we're going to do is we're going to call observe card. Oh yes, we also need to card position. And now this, I'm going to take in, call the React.render in here. Just a quick note, you don't actually need to import card position. I did that by mistake. Yes, we need the move card function, so we're going to import move card from game. Cool. As you can see, we now have a simple use case of React DND. We now have this card, we have a bunch of lists, and we have a whole list drag drop context, right? So our card is the drag source, and each individual list is a drop target in itself. See? Every time I drop something in a list, this drop function is called, which then calls this move card function. This move card function is now passed the new color of the list, and it recalls this function with the new card position. That's basically it. You have your drag source, which is the card. You have your list, which is a drop target, and you have the list entire div, which is your entire drag drop context. Those are the three basic parts of React DND: a drag drop context, a drag source, and a drop target. I hope you all learned something today in my tutorial, and I hope it can really benefit you guys in the future. Thank you for watching.